Good morning. Today is Tuesday. It is the day after yesterday and the day before tomorrow. Anyway, I am reading another segment in this book that I've been reading. This one is on Ida B. Wells. Ida B. Wells, I have to look down, was born in Mississippi in 1862, and she was a journalist. Check out my channel, subscribe if you like random stuff. I'm also tracking my weight loss journey. I do gardening, and sometimes I show what I'm cooking, but I'm not really any specific channel. So it doesn't always follow into the YouTube algorithms or whatever. They don't know probably where to put me. But if you happen to run across this and you like it, or if you know somebody who would like it, share it with them. Because I know two people that are listening and seem to like it. And I'm doing this special for a friend of mine who has low vision and she gets a lot of books on tape. So I'm doing this for my friend, and we will call her L. And I know that somebody named T is watching who's very, very close to me, and I love them both very much. Okay, so here goes. I'm going to flip it down. All right, so I just kind of got up, and so hopefully my voice, I'm going to be closer to the phone today. Ida Bell Wells was born on July 16th, 1862, a little over a year after the start of the Civil War. Although Holly Springs, Mississippi, served as Union Army headquarters for a time under Confederate forces routed the Yankees, no bloody battle savaged her little town. The yearning for freedom raged strong within her mother, Elizabeth, a cook, and her father, James, the son of his master and a carpenter by trade. When freedom came in 1865, they embraced it with all their might and began readying their little girl for a brighter life. Very soon after the war, the Federal Freedmen's Bureau started a school in Holly Springs, which years later evolved into Rust College. Ida's father became a trustee of this new school, which his children would attend. The value of education was not the only thing Ida learned from her father. He also was a model for race pride and standing your ground. For example, in 1867, Mr. Wells announced his intention to exercise his newly granted, highly priced right to vote in the Mississippi election. I have to get a little bit more comfortable here. I am sorry. Okay. His employer, who was also his landlord, urged him to vote his way against the Republicans. But like 99% of his people, Ida's father believed in the party of Abraham Lincoln, and he paid a price for his convictions. For when he returned from the polls, he found that his boss had locked him out of the shop, locking in the tools of his trade that belonged to him. Mr. Wells was not about to beg for forgiveness or his tools. He set up house and a carpentry shop across the street. Standing up to this white man was an especially courageous act, considering that many African Americans had been treated to violence for less. Like others in Holly Springs and the surrounding area, Ida's parents were still wincing from the memory of what a white mob had done to the African American community in Memphis, Tennessee, the previous year. After the mob's 3-day lawless spree, there were about 50 African Americans dead, about 80 wounded, and 4 churches, a dozen schools, and more than 80 houses in ashes. Ida was about 4 at the time, not too young to know the dangers that African Americans face. Quote, I heard the words Ku Klux Klan long before I knew what they meant, she wrote years later, adding that she knew the words meant something fearful from the way her mother paced the floor on nights when her father was at political meetings. During her childhood, Ida also knew plenty of hard work. As the oldest, she was her mother's primary helper with housework and the care of her younger children. The training came in handy sooner than she had expected. When Ida was 16, a yellow fever epidemic made orphans of the Wells children. Wow. Ida was visiting her grandmother, who lived about 30 miles away in Tippah County, when yellow fever struck Memphis, Tennessee, and then burned its way through, ravaging Holly Springs. Among the many victims it left in its wake were Ida's parents and her 9-month-old brother. When Holly Springs was still a danger zone, against the advice of her elders, Ida took a freight train home, worried sick about her brothers James Jr., age 11, and George, age 9, and her sisters Eugenia, age 15, who 2 years before had been stricken with a disease that left her paralyzed from the waist down, Annie, age 5, and Lily, age 2. What would become of them and of her, Ida fretted. Mr. Wells had been a Mason, a secret social and civic men's organization. His lodge brothers were duty-bound to look out for his children. In fulfilling this obligation, they proposed to apprentice James and George as carpenters and send Annie and Lily to families where a little girl, but only one, was desperately wanted. As for Ida, the men reasoned that since she was soon to be a woman, she was old enough to take care of herself. Because of her handicap, Eugenia was a burden no one wanted to bear. She would be sent to the poorhouse. When the men sentenced the Wells children to separation, Ida was speechless with grief and anger, but soon she found her voice. I said that it would make my father and mother turn over in their graves to know their children had been scattered like that, she recalled years later. Ida then presented the Masons with a counterproposal. If they would help her find a job, she would take care of her siblings. When she refused to budge from her position, they suggested that she try for a job as a teacher. Ida B. Wells passed the teacher's examination and was appointed to a one-room schoolhouse in the country with a salary of $25 a month. Thus, she became head of household with 5 younger brothers and sisters to support, but she had help. Her parents had left a nest egg of a few $100s, and there was her grandmother and a friend of her mother's to help with the children. These women were blessings indeed, because Wells stayed out in the country from Monday to Friday, boarding with her student's family. And so it went week after week, month after month, until Wells moved to Memphis, Tennessee, taking Annie and Lily with her, while poor, helpless Eugenia went to live with Aunt Belle, their mother's sister. As for James and George, they went to work but later moved to Memphis too. Ida B. Wells eventually found a teaching job on the outskirts of Memphis. She was grateful for the work but admitted that she never cared for teaching. Yet she gave it her all because she was determined to be independent, and teaching was one of the few respectable careers open to African American women then. For Wells, Memphis was a far better place to be. As Miriam DaCosta Willis points out in her introduction to the Memphis Daily of Ida B. Wells, this country girl took a big fancy to this bustling city. She was excited by the glitter, the gaslit theaters, cobblestone streets, railroad terminals, department stores, churches and synagogues, schools and hospitals, and the waterfront teeming with steamboats and cotton barges. With her move to Memphis in the early 1880s, Wills began to blossom. She loved reading, going to the theater, and receiving quite a few gentlemen callers. She was a member of a, don't know how to pronounce it, Lyceum, Lyceum, a group of young men and women who met on Fridays for readings, recitations, and musical programs. Wells also became editor of a literary newsletter, The Evening Star. Through her activities, she made the acquaintance of many prominent members of the city's African American community, such as millionaire businessman Robert R. Church and his daughter Molly, who grew up to be the formidable civil and women's rights activist Mary Church Terrell. Another of Wells' pastimes was corresponding with old friends and new acquaintances, sometimes writing as many as 10 letters a day. Given the limitations on travel and the fact that Alexander Graham Bell had only patented the telephone in 1876, letters were really the only way to keep in touch and develop relationships. They were also a place for shaping and expressing her ideas, for having intelligent conversation. Unbeknownst to her, all this letter writing, plus her work on the Evening Star, was preparation for a career in journalism. It was an unfortunate incident that catapulted her into this career, a humiliation that gave her something to really write about. One day in early May 1884, Wells, now in her 20s, boarded a train in Memphis. Since she had purchased a first-class ticket, she took her seat in a first-class car. However, the conductor refused her ticket and ordered her to move to another car, the filthy smoking car, which the officials of the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad had decided was good enough for the colored. Some 30 years Before Rosa Parks was even born, Wells took a stand sitting down. She refused to budge. When the conductor attempted to move her, she bit his hand. But her victory was short-lived. He called for backup. All 4 feet 6 inches of Wells was soon pulled out of her seat and out of the car, with white passengers applauding the men. What happened to Wells was a sign of the times. The years before, the United States Supreme Court had ruled as unconstitutional the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which declared that African Americans were to be treated as first-class citizens in restaurants, theaters, hotels, trains, and such. There was no national law against discrimination. States were free to do as they pleased on the issue of civil rights. In 1884, Tennessee, like many southern states, was putting in motion laws that would allow segregation in public places and no blacks allowed policies in the private sector. It was the dawn of Jim Crow. Rather than accept the humiliation of being forced to sit in the second-class coach, Wells got off the train. She was beyond furious. As she would admit later in life, her temper was her besetting sin. Fortunately, she almost always found a constructive outlet for her anger. In this case, she sued the railroad. Ida B. Wells won, and the railroad was ordered to pay her $500. The ruling was not merely a personal gain for Wells, but also an important victory for the civil rights movement underway since the end of the Civil War. The city's white-owned paper, the Memphis Daily Appeal, scoffed at what was such good news for Wells and her people at large. The headline to the story of the verdict, which appeared on Christmas Day, 1884, began, "A darky damsel obtains a verdict for damages against the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad." Again, Wells' victory was short-lived. The railroad appealed the case, and on April 4, 1887, the Tennessee Supreme Court overruled the verdict, maintaining that the smoking car qualified as first-class accommodations for the colored. Wells was shocked and deeply pained. A week after the ruling, she wrote this in her diary. "I felt so disappointed because I had hoped for such great things from my suit for my people generally. I have firmly believed all along that the law was on our side and would, when we appealed to it, give us justice. O God, is there no redress, no peace, no justice in this land for us?" Wells wrote about her suit against the railroad for the Living Way, a Baptist weekly. The editor was so impressed with the content and character of her piece that he invited her to write a regular column. She would write about a range of social and political issues, and she would choose as a pen name Iola. Iola became quite a sensation. Her letters, as these essays were called, began appearing in many major African American-owned newspapers and magazines. The New York Age, the Detroit Plain Dealer, the Indianapolis Freeman, and the American Baptists of Louisville, Kentucky, and Philadelphia's AME Church Review. Soon she was hailed as the Princess of the Press. Some male journalists were rather condescending, but others gave Wells her due. For instance, T. Thomas Fortune, founder of New York Age, once noted that Iola handles a goose quill with diamond point as easily as any man in newspaper work, and has plenty of nerve and as sharp as a steel trap. Among the biting pieces Wells penned were Functions of Leadership, Women in Leadership, and Iola on Discrimination. For Wells, writing was a way to educate, motivate, and empower others. It was also a labor of love. In the beginning, payment came in form of free subscriptions and extra copies of the periodicals for which she wrote. Her first paying assignment was with the American Baptist for the lavish sum of $1 a letter weekly. She wasn't being sarcastic. She could buy a pair of shoes for about $2.50. Still, she wasn't earning enough from her freelance writing to leave teaching. But she wished she could. As she put it, "Since the appetite grows for what it feeds on, the desire came to own a paper." This desire was satisfied when the Reverend Taylor Nightingale, sales manager, and J.L. Fleming, business manager, asked her to be the editor of their newspaper, The Free Speech and Headlight. Wells accepted the job, but only after Fleming and Nightingale agreed to let her buy a 1/3 interest in the business and become a co-owner of what was soon renamed The Free Speech. Wells' pen points became even sharper. A piece about the immoral conduct of a minister lost her a few friends. Another about the school board's neglect of schools for African Americans got her fired from her teaching job. Now that it was her only source of income, Wells had to make the free speech a more profitable business. To this end, she went on a lengthy tour of Tennessee, Arkansas, moving the table because I got to shift my weight. I get stiff. Okay. Let me restart that sentence. Where did it go? Okay, to this end, she went on a lengthy tour of Tennessee, Arkansas, and Mississippi, canvassing for subscriptions and advertising. Through her efforts, the free speech circulation rose from 1,500 to 4,000, as she had very high hopes for more readers. Then something happened in a section of Memphis known as the Curve, which Wells said changed the whole course of her life. In early March 1892, while Wells was in Natchez, Mississippi, promoting the free speech, another newspaper delivered her some dreadful news. Her friend, Thomas Moss, co-owner of the People's Grocery Company, and his partners Calvin McDowell and Henry Stewart had been lynched. The men had defended themselves against an armed gang incited by a white grocer across the street who resented the People's Grocery because it meant fewer black dollars were coming his way. This man thought he might scare Moss, McDowell, and Stewart into going out of business. He had not expected them to defend their persons, their property, and their right to engage in free enterprise. He had not expected things to escalate into a full-fledged fight, but it did, and 3 of the white thugs were shot. Moss, McDowell, and Stewart were summarily thrown in jail on that terrible Saturday night. In no time at all, a mob formed outside the jail. Knowing what such a mob was capable of, a group of African American men also gathered at the jail. They had been disarmed by a court order, but they were there anyway, hoping that their presence would be a deterrence to violence. When word came that the white men's wounds were not fatal, the African American men thought the danger was over. They left, and the African American community breathed easier. But the men had all been too optimistic. Around daybreak, a mob broke into the jail, snatched Moss, McDowell, and Stewart out, and took them to the outskirts of town where they faced a hail of bullets, and their dead and dying bodies were hanged. No African American in Memphis was able to rest easy that day. When a group gathered at the People's Grocery to talk about and mourn the lynchings, a judge ordered the sheriff to take 100 men, go out to the curve at once, and shoot down on sight any Negro who appears to be making trouble. A group of white Memphians followed the judge's directive and went hunting. In the process, they looted the People's Grocery, destroying what they did not eat or cart away. Generally, the word lynch brings to mind an image of a person hanging from a tree. But lynching is not the act of hanging. It is mob murder, be it by burning, by beating, or by shooting. Usually lynching is a spontaneous act, but often lynchings have been planned and even announced ahead of time so that people could come and watch. Though not all those lynched in this nation have been African Americans, the overwhelming majority have been. For example, according to Carter G. Woodson, the father of Black history, from 1885 to 1918, there were 3,224 lynchings, and 702 of the victims were white. Ida B. Wells mourned for all 3 men lynched that early morning in Memphis, but doubly so for Moss, her friend. He had been an upstanding member of the community, who worked by day as a postman, the first African American in the city to do so. She was pained for his widow, Betty Moss, also a good friend, for the couple's little girl and boy, to whom Wells was godmother, and for the as-yet unborn child Mrs. Moss was carrying at the time. Wells was grieved in a new, more profound way for her people as a whole. It had been reported that Thomas Moss's last words were, "Tell my people to go west. There is not justice for them here." Wells pressed for some justice in her editorials in this free speech, but the murderers, whose identities were no secret, were never even arrested. Abandoning all hope for justice, Wells championed Moss's cause and wrote editorials exhorting the African American community in Memphis to heed his parting words. Wells wrote, "The city of Memphis has demonstrated that neither character nor standing avails the Negro if he dares to protect himself against the white man or become his rival. There is nothing we can do about the lynching now, as we are outnumbered and without arms. There is therefore only one thing left that we can do. save our money, and leave a town which will neither protect our lives and property nor give us a fair trial in the courts, but take us out and murder us in cold blood when accused by white persons. Many did as Moss and Wells urged, heading for Kansas and for the Oklahoma Territory. So many left that the white community soon became alarmed and then enraged. This black exodus meant fewer customers for white merchants, more vacancies for white realtors and landlords, and fewer workers for businesses. And many middle and upper class white women would have to clean their own houses now that the pool of domestics was getting smaller. White Memphis began to see black Memphis in a whole new light as a valuable resource. Ida B. Wells came to see lynching in a whole new light, and she turned her journalistic attention to the problem, researching some 700 cases of white on black mob murder and finding that most who had been lynched had not even been guilty as charged by the vigilantes. Not only did Wells discover that time and again the popular charge of rape of a white woman was very often bogus, she also found that many African American men had been lynched for arguing with or talking back to a white person, for petty theft, and for just being black. She found, too, that the lynch victims included women and teenagers. In 100 Years of Lynching, first published a century after Wells was born in 1962, Ralph Ginsberg collected hundreds of newspaper accounts that bear witness to the red record of racial atrocities in the United States. This book provides examples of the kinds of incidents Wells investigated and the kinds she tried to prevent. The first entry is an item from the New York Truth Seeker dated April 17, 1870, and headline, Negro at West Point Knifed by Fellow Cadets. West Point, New York, April 15th. A color cadet was recently taken from his bed, gagged, bound, and severely beaten, and then his ears were slit. He says that he cannot identify his assailants. The other cadets claim that he did it himself. It was incidents like this that led Wells to the conclusion that lynching was about more than some kind of abstract hatred. It was ultimately a way, as Wells explained, to keep the race terrorized, so as to keep her people from progressing socially and economically. Knowing that she would incur the wrath of some white people, Wells spoke out boldly about lynching and the free speech. One of her editorials so incensed some that a white-owned newspaper, the Commercial Appeal, reprinted it with the statement that the black wretch who had written the piece ought to be tied to a stake at the corner of two of the city main streets and, after getting done up with a pair of tailor's scissors, burned. After more rioting, inciting words, the newspaper closed with, "We hope we have said enough." They had. That evening, a committee of concerned citizens broke into the free speech and tore it apart. They left a parting note promising death to Ida B. Wells. When Wells received the threat, she was hundreds of miles away. Right after she had finished her editorial, she left Memphis to attend an African Methodist Episcopal Church conference in Philadelphia. While east, she had gone to New York City to visit fellow journalist T. Thomas Fortune and other friends. Given her temper, it is not surprising that Wells' first impulse was to return home immediately. But she was not a fool. She knew that the committee was quite capable of making good its threat. She knew, too, that she could do more for her people alive than dead. So she remained in New York, becoming an even greater force in exile. Her base was T. Thomas Fortune's New York Age, though which she stepped up her anti-lynching crusade. Her first major show of support came from a group of African American women. Author and staff writer for the New Age, Victoria Earle Matthews, was one of the organizers of a testimonial dinner for Wells. The event, held on October 5, 1892, at New York City Lyric Hall, was attended by leading civic-minded women in the East. The dinner was not only a great inspiration for Wells, it also was a historic moment for African American women, for it was the spark of the Negro Women's Club movement, fostered by a host of political and social service organizations that sprang up in the late 19th and early 20th century. At Lyric Hall, the courageous Iola was given $500 to help her resurrect the free speech, but Wells did not restart the newspaper. Instead, she used the money to publish a pamphlet, Southern Horrors, Lynch Laws in All Its Phases. Armed with this publication and her righteous indignation, she began lecturing around the country to raise awareness about lynching and to do induce others to form anti-lynching societies that would recruit supporters and pressure the government to do something about this injustice. Wells took her campaign across the Atlantic in 1893 and again in 1894. She broadcast her country's red record through the written and spoken word in England, Scotland, and Wales. She was hopeful that the energies and resources the British had put into the anti-slavery movement would be channeled into the anti-lynching crusade. The formation of the London Anti-Lynching Committee, headed by Queen Victoria's son-in-law, was just one example of how England responded to the challenge. Wells' appeal to the British infuriated many white Americans. They told the British, in so many words, to mind their own business. They also made sure that articles attacking Wells' character reached England. Soon after her return to the United States in 1894, Wells settled in Chicago, where a year earlier she had formed the Ida B. Wells Club. On both sides of the Atlantic, Wells was most effective. Whenever she traveled, she left in her wake more concerned citizens and anti-lynching organizations. Along the way, she produced another document to bolster her efforts, a red record, tabulated statistics and alleged causes of lynchings in the United States, 1892, 1893, 1894, published in 1895. This small book opens with one of Wells' most widely known pieces of writing, quote, "The Case Stated," end of quote, where that's the title of it. So her most widely known piece of writing is called The Case Stated, where she clearly and concisely speaks about the root causes of lynching and informs the reader that of the thousands of African Americans lynched since the end of the Civil War, only 3 white men have been tried, convicted, and executed. Wells' anti-lynching campaign had a profound impact on African American life and the consciousness of many whites. Lynching could no longer be ignored, and more it was openly condemned. In 1897, Wells retired from the public life. A few years earlier, she had married a widower with 2 sons, Ferdinand L. Barnett, an attorney and publisher of Chicago's first African American weekly, The Conservator, of which Wells eventually became editor. Ferdinand Barnett was a very supportive husband who aided his wife in her work, both through his newspaper and with his legal skills. He never tried to curb his wife's activities and would take care of their baby, Charles, born 1896, and the older boys on those occasions when she did not take the child with her on the road. But with the birth of her second child, Herman, in 1897, Wells decided to be a full-time mother. When Herman was 5 months old, however, Wells was pressed back into public service. A newly appointed postmaster in Anderson, South Carolina, was murdered by a mob in a particularly vicious way. Wells supporters in Chicago raised money to send her to Washington, D.C., where she met with President William McKinley and urged him to make lynching a federal crime. McKinley expressed concern, but he had another matter on his mind. Soon after Wells arrived in the capital, Congress declared war on Spain in 1898. With the Spanish-American War to deal with, McKinley would not make lynching a national priority, even if he had truly wanted to. Lynching, along with other impediments to African-American life and liberty, would always be a priority for Wells, even though it put her own life in jeopardy and earned her extremely nasty attacks from many in the white press. This hostility was enraging and hurtful, but it was not as painful as the resistance and lack of help from people she naturally assumed would be ardent supporters. While many white ministers did support her movement, too many failed to preach against lynching and racism in general in their pulpits. For her, their silence gave consent. Wells felt the same about Frances E. Willard, president of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the major women's organization of the time. Willard did not condemn lynching, and she publicly perpetuated images of African Americans as menaces to society. Wells' criticism of Willard upset many important white women, including suffragist Susan B. Anthony, who tried to persuade Wells to hold her tongue about Willard. It saddened Wells to discover that Anthony was not the friend to African Americans she had once thought her to be. Many African American male leaders also failed to support Wells' work, not because it was wrong, but because she was a woman. Like the majority of men of that day, while they may have applauded a woman's contribution to a cause, they felt that it was inappropriate for a woman to be too out front and center. Moreover, there were those who felt that Wells was simply too radical. Chief among them was Booker T. Washington, co-founder of Alabama's Tuskegee Institute and the most politically powerful African American of the day. Wells criticized Washington for not speaking up and out loud about lynching. For his part, Washington felt that the activism of people like Wells and later W.E.B. Du Bois on this and other issues was counterproductive, that open protest was a bad thing. Washington branded Wells a troublemaker, and on more than one occasion, he hurt her campaign. Many African Americans who headed educational and social institutions decided not to openly support Wells because they were afraid of Washington. He had influence with powerful white people, including President William McKinley and Theodore Roosevelt. Such people generally took his advice on which African American issues and organizations to support and which to ignore. It was her criticism of Washington that led the National Association of Colored Women, NACW, to distance itself from Wells. Although Wells had helped found the organization, Booker T. Washington's wife, the very powerful Margaret Murray Washington, was a member. The NACW's rejection was especially hurtful because it was supported by its president, Mary Church Terrell, whom Wells had known since they were young women in Memphis. Undaunted, Wells pressed on in her sometimes lonely crusade through her writings, speeches, and work as director of the Anti-Lynching Bureau of T. Thomas Fortune's Afro-American Council. She continued to keep records of and investigate instances like these. Sam Holt, burned at stake. Kissimmee Valley, Florida Gazette, April 28, 1899. Sam Holt, the Negro who is thought to have murdered Alfred Cranford and assailed Cranford's wife, was burned at the stake 1.25 miles from Newman, Georgia, Sunday afternoon, July 23rd at 2:30 o'clock. For sickening sights, harrowing details, and blood-curdling incidents, the burning of Holt is unsurpassed by any occurrence of a like kind ever heard of in the history of Georgia. One of the strangest features of the entire affair is the part played in the execution by a northern man. This man, whose name would not be divulged by those who knew him, announced that he was from the north while he calmly saturated Holt's clothing with kerosene oil. Mrs. Crawford, the rape victim, was not permitted to identify the Negro. She is ill, and it was thought the shock would be too great for her. The crowd was satisfied with the identification of Holt by Mrs. Cranford's mother, who did not, however, actually see Holt commit the crime. Mass played no part of the lynching. There was no secrecy. Negro freed, then lynched. Chicago Record, January 4th, 1901. Rome, Georgia, January 3rd. George Reed, a Negro charged with attempting to assault Mrs. J.M. Locklear of this city last night, was hanged today to a tree. His body was then riddled with bullets by a mob of 150 men. Reed protested his innocence. After his arrest this morning, the Negro was taken before Mrs. Locklear, but she failed to identify him, and he was returned to jail. However, the mob was not satisfied. The number of lynchings reported in 1903 was 104, and for the next year, 87. And by now, Wells was in her 40s and had given birth to 2 more children, Ida and Elfrida. Age and a growing family restricted her activism, but it did not make her quit. How could she, when newspapers continued to carry reports like this from the March 18, 1906 edition of the New York Tribune, headline, "Is lynched by orderly mob suspected of cow killing"? I don't know how to pronounce this. Plaquemines, Louisiana, March 17. William Carr, Negro, was lynched without ceremony here today by an orderly party of 30 masked men who hurried him to a railroad trestle and hanged him. He had been accused of killing a white man's cow. As part of her anti-lynching crusade, Wells continued to involve herself in issues and organizations relevant to equal opportunity and justice for African Americans. She was a founding member of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, which was formed in 1909. In 1910, she started the Negro Fellowship League, a settlement house in Chicago for Southern male migrants, which she and her husband funded. In 1913, she started the Alpha Suffrage Club to increase the political awareness of African American women in Illinois who had just received the right to vote. The number of lynchings continued to decrease. Increasing numbers of white people were finding lynching unacceptable. Many objected solely on moral grounds. For others, it was purely a matter of economics. Around 1910, a sizable number of African Americans began migrating north in search of better jobs and to escape terrorism. This migration would not become great until after World War I, but it had enough of an effect on white life to inspire editorials such as this one in August 15, 1913. Edition of Memphis Commercial Appeal, which declared, "Lynching bad for business. Killing Negroes just because one is in a bad humor ought also to be stopped. Now, the Negro is about the only dependable tiller of the soils in these parts. Compensation for existence is not keen enough to force many white people into the harder work. The Negro also is very useful as a distributor of money. About all he gets goes through his fingers. Commercially, then, he is a very valuable asset. It is not good business to kill him." The book doesn't say wow. I am reading this the first time, so I didn't read it through. But wow. Commercially, then, he is a very valuable asset. It is not good business to kill him. All right. The number of reported lynchings for 1913 was 48, and the annual count continued to go down. Wills remained vigilant, however. She investigated the spate of anti-black riots that swept the nation right before the end of World War I, in which hundreds of people were maimed, killed, or driven out of a town. As always, Wells made her findings known. One of the worst riots she investigated was the one that occurred in East St. Louis in July 1917, then in the summer of 1919. The riots in Chicago and other cities were so bloody that the period became known as the Red Summer. The movement to end these atrocities was strengthened when in 1919 the NAACP held a national conference on lynching and raised funds to investigate the horrors and campaign for anti-lynching law. The NAACP gained support through articles in its magazine, The Crisis, whose editor was NAACP co-founder W.E.B. Du Bois. And through booklets such as 30 Years of Lynching in the United States, 1889 to 1918, and Burning at the Stake in the U.S., 1919, the NAACP attracted a variety of social and civic organizations to join in the anti-lynching crusade. Wells had laid the foundation for all this. Now others championed her cause as strongly as she had for the past 3 decades. Still, she did not cease her activism. In 1930, when Wells was in her 60s, she ran for the Senate, reasoning that she might be a greater crusader for justice in her state by working within the system. She lost. But Wells was not defeated until March 25, 1831, when she died of a kidney disease. She collapsed 4 days earlier at her home while at work on her life story. She was close to the finish when the kidney attack literally cut her off in mid-sentence. This book was eventually edited by her daughter, Elfrida Duster, and published in 1970 with the title Crusade for Justice, the autobiography of Ida B. Wells. In this review of the book, a writer for the New York Times, Walter Goodman, remarked that Wells was a sophisticated fighter whose prose was as tough as her intellect. Historian John Hope Franklin said of the book, "Few documents written by an American woman approach this one either in importance or interest. This would come as no surprise to those who knew that our nation has seen few peoples as intrepid as Ida B. Wells." I hope you enjoyed that reading. I don't know if enjoyed the reading, or I hope that you enjoyed the fact that I put it out there for people to hear of the atrocities that have faced mankind, and that there have been brave people that have stood up to it when they're seeing it happening in the time they're living, even knowing that their lives are on the line and their families' lives, and that even people that they thought would support them didn't, and that they did what they knew in their hearts were right. And that is that reading. I actually thought lynching was always referencing hanging. I didn't know it was just murdering somebody through through mob type justice. So I maybe knew that one time, but when I think lynching, I always think hanging. I think because it was the most common way, but that's not what the word means, which is rather interesting. Anyway, have a good day. Peace. If you see injustices, maybe there is something we can do. Bye-bye.